Chapter 7, Part 1 of The History of Standard Oil, Volume 1 by Ida Tarbell. This recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Crisis of 1878. It was clear enough by the opening of 1878 that Mr. Rockefeller need no longer fear any serious trouble from the refining element. To be sure, there were scattered concerns still holding out, and some of them doing very well. But his latest move had put him in a position to cut off, or at least seriously to interfere with the very raw material in which they worked. It was hardly to be expected, after the defeat of the Pennsylvania, that any railroad would be rash enough to combine with even a strong group of refiners. As for independent pipe lines, there were so many ways of discouraging their building that it did not seem probable that any one would ever go far. It was only a matter of time, then, when all remaining outside refiners must come into his fold or die. Mr. Rockefeller's path would now have been smooth had it not been for the oil producers. But the oil producers, naturally his enemy, he being the buyer and they the seller, had become in the 6 years before Mr. Rockefeller had made himself the only gatherer of their oil, irreconcilable opponents of whatever he might do. The South Improvement Company they regarded, rightly enough, as devised to control the price of their product, and that scheme they wrongfully laid entirely at Mr. Rockefeller's door. Mr. Rockefeller had been only one of the originators of the South Improvement Company, but the fact that he had become later practically its only supporter, that he was the only one who had profited by it, and that he had turned his Cleveland plant into a machine for carrying out its provisions, had caused the oil country to fix on him the entire responsibility. Then the oil men's experience with Mr. Rockefeller in 1873 had been unfortunate. They charged the failure of their alliance to his duplicity. There is no doubt that Mr. Rockefeller played a shrewd and false game with the oil men in 1873, but the failure of their alliance was their own fault. They did not hold together. They failed to limit their production as they agreed. They suspected one another, and at a moment when, if they had been as patient and wise as their great opponent, they would have had the game in their own hands, and him at their feet, as he had been in 1872 for the sake of immediate returns, they abandoned some of the best features of their organizations and allied themselves with a man they distrusted. When that alliance failed, they threw on Mr. Rockefeller's shoulder a blame which they should have taken on their own. Another very real cause for their anxiety and dislike was that as the refiners' alliance progressed, the refiners made a much larger share of the profits than the producers thought fair. The abandoning of their alliance in 1873 had of course put an end to their measures for limiting production and for holding overproduction until it could be sold at the prices they thought profitable. The drill had gone on merrily through 1873, 1874, and 1875, regardless of consumption or prices. By the end of 1874 there were over 3.5 million barrels of oil in stock, more than twice what there had ever been before. Production was well to 1 million barrels a month, and prices that year averaged but $1.15 a barrel. For men who considered $3 a starvation price, this was indeed hard luck. Things looked better by the end of 1875, for production was falling off. By March, 1876, stocks had been so reduced that there was strong confidence that the price of crude oil must advance. By June the Oil City Derrick began to prophesy $3 oil, and to advise oil men to hold crude for that price. In August $3 was reached in the Oil City Exchange. It had been nearly 4 years since that price had been paid for oil, and the day the point was reached, August 25, the brokers fairly went mad. They jumped on their chairs, threw up their hats, beat one another on the back, while the spectators in the crowded galleries, most of them speculators, yelled in sympathy. Before 6 o'clock that day oil reached $3.1125. Nobody thought of stopping because it was supper time. The exchange was open until nearly midnight, prices booming on to $3.17.50. It seemed like old times in the Oil Region, the good old "flush times," when people made a fortune one day and threw it away the next. Of course, refined oil went up steadily with crude. Refined reached 21 3/8 cents in New York the day of this boom at Oil City. The day following the rise was one of the most exciting the oil exchange had ever seen. Never before, declared the Derrick in its report, was so much business done. From early in the morning until 10 o'clock at night the exchange was crowded by frantic speculators. Their awful excitement was clear from their blanched faces and wild voices. Fully 800,000 barrels of oil exchanged hands that day. The advance between the time the exchange opened and its close was over 55 cents. Refined in New York advanced in accordance with the market on the creek, closing at 24 cents. This went on for several days, when a new element in the situation began to force itself on the oil men's attention. One of the chief reasons on which they based their confidence in high prices for crude oil was the fact that the foreigners were short of refined oil. It was the custom then, as now, for exporters to buy their oil for the winter European trade in the late summer and early fall. When the boom began, the harbour at New York was beginning to fill up with ships for cargoes. But to the consternation of the oil men intent on keeping up the boom, the exporters were refusing to buy. They were declaring the price to which refined had risen to be out of proportion to the price of crude. More, they declared the latter a speculative price. Only once, they argued, had it touched $4, and the refiners were not buying at that price for manufacture. They were holding refined too high. It was early in September when the realization came upon the Oil Regions that a new element was in the problem, a veritable blockade in exports. As the days went on they saw that this was no temporary affair. They saw that Mr. Rockefeller's combination was at last carrying out just what it had been organised to do, forcing the price it wanted for refined. Day after day refined was held at 26 cents. Day after day the exporters refused to buy. It was not until the end of September, in fact, that they began to yield, as it was inevitable they should do, for the game was certainly in the hands of the refiners, and Europe had to have its light. The exporters began to see, too, that if they held off longer they might have to pay higher prices, for it was rumoured that the Standard Combination was shutting down its factories, literally making refined scarce, while crude oil was piling up in Pennsylvania. With the yielding of the exporter exactly what they feared occurred. The price was raised. The exporters balked again. The matter began to attract public attention. The New York Herald was particularly active in airing the situation, and did not hesitate to denounce it as a petroleum plot. The leaders were interviewed, among them Mr. Rockefeller. Mr. Rockefeller still held to his theory that to make oil dear was worthy of public approval. They had aimed to control the price of oil in a perfectly legitimate way, he told the Herald reporter, and the exporters would have to yield to their prices. By the end of October New York harbour was full of vessels, a mute protest against the corner, and it was not until November that the exporters finally gave in and began to take all the oil they could get at prices asked, which ranged from 26 to 35 cents. And these prices were held all through the winter of 1876-77 up to February 22. They were held regardless of the price of crude, for, do to their utmost, the producers could not keep their oil up to the corresponding price of refined. According to the scale of relative prices then accepted, 26 cents a gallon for refined meant $5 a barrel for crude, yet there was not a month in the entire period of this hold up that crude averaged that price. In December, when the average price of refined was 29 3/8 cents, crude was but $3.78 1/8 a barrel. The producers held meetings and passed resolutions, cursed the refiners, and talked of building independent refineries, filled the columns of the Derrick with open letters advocating a shutdown, an alliance of their own restrictive legislation, an oil men's railway, and what was more to the point some of them supported, with more or less fidelity, the efforts to build up counter movements noted in the last chapter, the Columbia Conduit Line, the Seaboard Pipe Line, and especially the alliance with the Empire Transportation Company attempted in the spring of 1877. There seemed more hope in this last combination than in any other movement, for they had faith in Colonel Potts, and besides they were accustomed to seeing the Pennsylvania Railroad get what it wanted. The defeat of the Pennsylvania was therefore the heavier blow. Indeed, the news of the sale of the Empire Pipe Lines to the Standard was like the sounding of the tocsin in the angry and baffled Oil Regions. It revived the spirit of 1872. But it was the spirit of 1872 with new dignity and a discretion such had never before been seen in the Bladen region. In every town from McKean County southwest of Butler, the oil towns hastened to organize themselves into a secret society. Little by little it came out that a Producers' Union had been organized. From all that could be learned, it looked very much as if the Petroleum Producers' Union had come into existence to do business. On November 21, 1877, the first meeting of the new organization was held. The Petroleum Parliament, or Congress, it was called. This Congress, which met in Titusville, was composed of 172 delegates. It was claimed that it represented at least 2,000 oil producers and not less than 75 millions in money. It is certain it included the representative men of the Oil Regions, those to whose daring hard work and energy the discovery and development of the oil fields, as they were known at that time, were entirely due. For 4 days the Congress was in session, and it is a remarkable comment on the seriousness with which it had undertaken its work that although reporters from all parts of the country interested in oil were present, nothing leaked out. In December a second session of 4 days was held in Titusville, but no announcement of what was doing was made to the press. Indeed, it was only as lines of action developed that the public became familiar with what the producers had resolved on in the days of secret session which they had held. Their resolutions had been eminently wise, and they undertook their support vigorously and intelligently. First and foremost, they resolved to stand by all efforts to secure an outlet to the independent seaboard of the Standard and the allied railroads. 2 enterprises were put before them at once. The first was what was known as the Equitable Petroleum Company, an organization started by one of the most resourceful and active independent men in the oil country, one of whom we are to hear more, Lewis Emery, Jr. This company, in which some 200 oil producers in the Bradford field had taken stock, proposed to lay a pipe line to Buffalo and to ship their oil thence by the Erie Canal. They had acquired a right of way to Buffalo, and had capital pledged to carry out the project. The second enterprise to come before the newly formed union was much more ambitious. It was nothing less than a revival of Mr. Harley's enterprise, which had attracted so much attention in 1876. It was revived now by the 3 men who had been operating the Columbia Conduit Line under a lease, Messrs. Benson, McKelvy and Hopkins, who had been set free by the sale of that property to the Standard. Their experience with the pipe line business had convinced them it was one of the most lucrative departments of the oil industry. They believed, too, that oil could be pumped over the mountains, and no sooner were they free than they took up Mr. Harley's old idea and engaged the same engineer he had brought into the enterprise, General Herman Haupt, to survey a route from Brady's Bend on the Allegheny River to Baltimore, Maryland, a distance of 235 miles. To both of these projects the General Council of the Union gave promise of support. The demand for interstate commerce legislation was renewed at once by the Union, and in December E. G. Patterson, the head of the committee having the matter in hand, prepared the first draft of an act which was put in formal shape by George B. Hibbert of Buffalo, counsel employed by the Union for this purpose. Mr. Hibbert also prepared a memorandum of the law on the subject. The bill prepared by Mr. Patterson and Mr. Hibbert was introduced into the House of Representatives in May, 1878, by Lewis F. Watson, whose home was in Warren County, Pennsylvania. It was called into committee and came out as the Reagan bill, and as such was passed by the end of the year by the House, but only to be smothered later in the Senate. At the same time that the effort was going on in Washington for relief, the Legislature of Pennsylvania was being besieged again for a free pipe line bill and an anti discrimination bill. Both of these projects failed, and the committee having them in charge said bitterly in its report to the Union: "How well we have succeeded at Harrisburg you all know. It would be in vain for your committee to describe the efforts of the Council in this direction. It has been simply a history of failure and disgrace. If it has taught us anything, it is that our present lawmakers, as a body, are ignorant, corrupt, and unprincipled; that the majority of them are, directly or indirectly, under the control of the very monopolies against whose acts we have been seeking relief. There has been invented by the Standard Oil Company no argument or assertion, however false or ridiculous, which has not found a man in the Pennsylvania Legislature mean enough to become its champion." On every side, indeed, the producers hastened to protect themselves against the lord of the Oil Regions, as Mr. Rockefeller not inaptly was called on the completion of his pipe line monopoly. That they were not merely alarmists in thinking that they must do something to protect their interests was demonstrated sooner than was anticipated. The demonstration was hurried by an unforeseen and difficult situation — a great outpouring of oil in a new field — the Bradford or Northern Field in McKean County, Pennsylvania. About the time that Mr. Rockefeller's lordship was realised, it became certain that a deposit of oil had been discovered which was going to lead soon to a production vastly in excess of the consumption, as well as in excess of the then existing facilities for gathering and storing oil. If Mr. Rockefeller wished to keep his monopoly, he must, it was evident, enter upon a campaign of expansion calling for an immense expenditure of energy and money. He must lay pipes in 100 directions to get the output of new wells. He must build tanks holding thousands of barrels to receive the oil. And all of this must be done quickly if rivals were to be kept out of the way. There was no hesitation on the part of the United Pipe Lines. One of the greatest construction feats the country has ever seen was put through in the years 1878, 1879, and 1880 in the Bradford oil field by the Standard interest. It was a wonderful illustration of the surpassing intelligence, energy, and courage with which the Standard Oil attacks its problems. But while it was putting through this feat, it instituted a policy toward the producers which was regarded by them as tyrannical and unjustifiable. The first manoeuvre in this new policy hit the producer in a very tender spot, for it concerned the price he was to receive for oil. The method which prevailed at the time in handling and buying and selling oil was this: at the request of a well owner connected with his pipe line, his oil was run and credited to him in the pipe line office. Here he could hold it as long as he wished by paying a storage charge. If he wished to sell his credit balance, as oil to his account was called, he simply gave the buyer an order on the line for the oil, and it was transferred to the account of the new buyer. The pipe lines frequently had hundreds of thousands of barrels of oil in hand, and they traded with this oil as banks do with their deposits. That is, they issued certificates for each 1,000 barrels of oil on hand, and these certificates were negotiable like any other paper. Now the United Pipe Lines acknowledged itself a common carrier, and so was obliged to discharge the duty of collecting oil on demand, or at least within a reasonable time after the demand of its patrons. But in December, 1877, after the monopoly was completed, they refused to discharge their obligations in the customary way. On the plea that they had not sufficient tankage to carry oil in the Bradford field, they issued an order that no oil would be run in that district for anyone unless it was sold for immediate shipment. That is, no oil would be taken to hold for storage; it would be taken for shipping only. At the same time the Standard buyer, J. A. Bostwick, decreed that henceforth no Bradford oil would be bought for immediate shipment unless it was offered at less than the market price. No fixed discount was set. The seller was asked what he would take. His offer was, of course, according to his necessities. Even then an answer was not always immediately given. The seller was told to come back in 5 or 10 days, and he would be told if his oil would be taken. A feature of the new order, particularly galling to the oil men, was the manner in which it was enforced. Formerly the buyer and seller had met freely in the oil exchanges and their business offices, and transactions had been carried on as among equals. Now the producers were obliged to form in line before the United Pipe Line offices, and to enter one at a time to consult the buyer. A line of 100 men or more often stood during the hours set before the office, waiting their turn to dispose of their oil. It should be said in justice to Mr. Bostwick that he was not the first buyer to take oil at a discount. The producers themselves frequently offered oil at less than the market price when in need of money, but Mr. Bostwick was the first buyer in a situation to force them to make the discount regularly. When these orders came, few of the producers had sufficient private tankage to take care of any amount of oil. Here was the situation then. To keep oil from running on the ground, the producer must sell it. But if he sold it, he must take a price from 2 to 25 cents or more below the market. The immediate shipment order was not an invention of the United Pipe Lines. It had been enforced more than once for brief periods by various lines, when they found their capacity overcrowded by some unexpected situation. In 1872 epizootic among the horses so upset things in the Oil Regions that for a short time an immediate shipment order was enforced. In 1872, when the pipe lines were overtaxed by a great outpouring of oil in the Lower Field, immediate shipment had been attempted, but at that time there were still so many independent pipes struggling for business that the movement met no success. Now, however, the United Pipe Line had things its own way. That they were not ready to meet the growing Bradford production is plain from a study of the figures. There were in the Oil Regions at the close of 1877, according to the Oil City Derrick, 4,000,000 barrels of tankage. There was on hand at this time 3,127,837 barrels of oil, but the empty tankage was in the wrong place. In the Bradford field, where the daily production had suddenly increased from 2,000 barrels in January to 8,451 barrels in December, there was only a little over 200,000 barrels of tankage. In order to take care of the oil, the pipe lines began to make nearly all their shipments from that field, and oil piled up in the Lower Region to the great dissatisfaction of the producers there. As soon as the situation of the Bradford field was realised, both the United Pipes and the producers began a furious campaign of tank building. By the beginning of April, 1878, the tankage there had been increased to 1,152,028 barrels. Between April 1 and November 1, 70 tanks of from 10,000 to 25,000 barrels capacity were built in McKean County. The greater number of these belonged to the producers. According to the United Pipe Line statement, there was under their control in the entire Oil Regions in October 5,200,000 barrels of tankage, two-thirds of which belonged to producers but was held by them under a lease. But oil poured from the ground faster than tanks could be built. In 6 months, that is by July, 1878, the daily output of Bradford had become over 18,000 barrels, an increase of 10,000 barrels a day over that of the previous December. That it was a most difficult situation for everybody is evident. There was but one way to prevent loss: shut down the wells and stop the drill. But this the producers refused to consider. Of course the price of oil went down rapidly, so far did the production exceed consumption. But why, cried the producer, when oil is already so low, take advantage of our necessity and force us into competition with each other? Why enforce this immediate shipment? They answered their question themselves, and began then to make a charge against the Standard, which they continue to make to day. That is, that it habitually meets the extraordinary expenses to which it is put by depressing the price of crude oil, taking it out of the producer. The Bradford region demanded great investments, therefore immediate shipment. The producer pays. The writer has no documentary proof that this is Mr. Rockefeller's policy, but there is no question that the Oil Region believes it is, and this belief must be taken into account if one attempts to explain the long warfare of the oil country on him and his company. It is a common enough thing to day, indeed, to hear oil producers in northwestern Pennsylvania remark facetiously, when a new endowment to Chicago University is reported. Yes, I contributed so much on such a day. Don't you remember how the market slumped without a cause? The university needed the money, and so Mr. Rockefeller called on us to stand and deliver. A few months after immediate shipment was begun, a new cause for dissatisfaction arose. More or less private tankage leased to the lines had always been in existence. It enabled the producer to carry his oil without paying storage, and of course it was the business of the company to empty this storage within a reasonable time after the owner demanded it. But in the spring the lines, under the same plea of under capacity, refused to carry out this duty to the tank owner. That is, they refused to give him his tankage although he had sold his oil. Thus A owns 5,000 barrels of tankage. It is full. He sells a proportion of it to Mr. Bostwick and asks the United Pipe Lines to run the oil accumulated at his wells. But the United Pipe Lines refuses on the ground that the line is full. The loss to producers incident upon these orders was terrible. All over the Bradford field men saw their oil running on the ground, though they offered to sell it at ruinous prices, and though they might have thousands of barrels of tankage leased to the United Lines. Yet they did not riot. Conscious that their own reckless drilling had brought on the trouble, they cursed the Standard and put down more wells. But in the spring of 1878 Mr. Rockefeller and his colleagues instituted a series of manoeuvres which shattered the last remnant of confidence the oil men had in the sincerity of their claim that they were doing their utmost to relieve the distressed Oil Regions, and that their measures were necessary to hold the producers in check. The pipe lines began to refuse to load cars for the shippers who supplied the few independent refiners with oil. The experiences of many of these independent men have been told before the courts. For instance, W. H. Nicholson, the representative of Mr. Olin of New York, a shipper of petroleum, testified that in May, 1878, he began to have difficulty in getting cars. At Olean one day Mr. Olin telegraphed to the officials of the Erie road to know if he could get 100 cars to run east. The reply came back, yes. About noon Mr. Nicholson says he saw Mr. O'Day, the manager of the United Pipe Lines, in which his oil was stored, and told him that he was waiting to have his cars loaded. Mr. Day at once said he could not load the cars. "But I have an order from the Erie officials giving me the cars," Mr. Nicholson objected. "That makes no difference," O'Day replied. "I cannot load cars except upon an order from Pratt." Nor would he do it. The cars were not loaded for Mr. Nicholson, although at that time he had 10,000 barrels of oil in the United Pipe Lines and an order for 100 cars from the officials of the Erie road in his hand. B. B. Campbell, at that time president of the Producers' Union, gave his experience at this time in the suit of the Commonwealth against the Pennsylvania Railroad. "I never heard of a scarcity of cars until the early part of June, 1878. I came to Parker about 5 o'clock in the evening and found the citizens in a state of terrible excitement. The pipe lines would not run oil unless it was sold. The only shippers we had in Parker of any amount, viz., the agents of the Standard Oil Company, would not buy oil, stating that they could not get cars. Hundreds of wells were stopped to their great injury. Thousands more, whose owners were afraid to stop them for fear of damage by salt water, were pumping the oil on the ground. I used all the influence I had to prevent an outbreak and destruction of railroad and pipe lines. I at once went over to the Allegheny Valley Railroad office and telegraphed to John Scott, president of the Allegheny Valley Railroad Company. The refusal of the United to run oil unless sold upon immediate shipment, and of the railroad to furnish cars, had created such a degree of excitement here that the more conservative part of the citizens will not be able to control the peace, and I fear that the scenes of last July will be repeated on an aggravated scale. That message I left in the office about 7 o'clock in the evening. I got up the next morning before 7 and received an answer. "What would you advise should be done? John Scott." I answered, "Will you meet to morrow morning?" which would be Saturday. On Saturday morning I came in on an early train and met at the depot Mr. Shinn, then, I believe, vice president of the Allegheny Valley Railroad Company, David A. Stewart, one of the directors of the road, and Thomas M. King, assistant superintendent. I spoke very plainly to Mr. Shinn, telling him that the idea of a scarcity of cars on daily shipments of less than 30,000 barrels a day was such an absurd barefaced pretense that he could not expect men of ordinary intelligence to accept it, as the preceding fall, when business required, the railroads could carry day after day from 50,000 to 60,000 barrels of oil. Mr. Shinn stated clearly that I knew that the Allegheny Valley Railroad Company did not control the oil business over its line, but was governed entirely and exclusively by orders received from the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. I then requested him to be the vehicle of communicating to the Pennsylvania railroad officials my views on the subject, telling him that I was convinced that unless immediate relief was furnished and cars afforded there would be an outbreak in the Oil Regions. After further conversation we parted. My interview with them was not as officials of the Allegheny Valley Railroad Company, but as representatives of the oil traffic carried and controlled by the Pennsylvania road. On the next Monday I returned to Parker. After passing Red Bank, where the low grade road, the connecting link between the Valley Road and the Philadelphia and Erie Road, meets the Valley Road, between that point and Parker, the express train was delayed for over half an hour in passing through hundreds of empty oil cars. In June another exasperating episode occurred, growing out of the attempts of the oil men to secure independent routes to the seaboard. As we have seen, two enterprises had been launched late in 1877 under the patronage of the Petroleum Producers' Union. As soon as the Equitable had acquired its right of way to Buffalo, Mr. Emery, the head of the company, his papers in hand, sought an interview with representatives of the Buffalo and McKean Road, and told them if they did not consent that the Equitable lay a pipe line to their road, and did not contract to carry the oil from that connection to Buffalo, the pipe line to Buffalo would be laid. After considerable negotiation a contract was made with the railroad, and by June the new company was ready with pipe line, cars and barges to carry oil to New York. But no sooner did they attempt to begin operations than the railroad, under pressure from the Pennsylvania Railroad, it was claimed, refused to carry out its contracts. The cars the Equitable ordered sent to the loading track were refused. A side track it had laid was torn up, the frog torn out. Everything indeed was done to prevent the Equitable doing business, though finally a vigorous appeal to the law brought the road to terms, and in July oil began to flow eastward by this indirect route. No sooner did the Standard find that the Equitable people were really doing business than they appealed to the railroads. A meeting of the representatives of the trunk lines was held in Saratoga in July, and the rates on crude eastward were dropped to 80 cents to meet the new competition. While this fight was going on against the Equitable, all sorts of interference were being put in the way of the seaboard line between Brady's Bend and Baltimore. It was ridiculed as chimerical to attempt to pump oil over the mountains, and General Haupt was declared to be a visionary engineer with a record of failures. All the old stories retailed in 1876 were dragged out again. The farmers were told that the leakage from the pipe line would ruin their fields and endanger their buildings, and an active campaign to excite prejudice was carried on again in the farmers' papers. Philadelphia and Pittsburgh both fought the plan, the press and chambers of commerce opposing the free pipe bill at that time before the Legislature, and the project generally. In Pittsburgh the opposition created almost a riot, for the oil producers of the Lower Field, who had long bought their supplies there, now threatened to boycott the city if the pipe line was fought. So strong was the opposition that capital took fright, and the company found it most difficult to secure funds. This opposition to the pipe line was, of course, charged against the Standard and the Pennsylvania Railroad. Now, while the railroads were refusing cars to independent shippers, or if they gave an order for them the United Pipe Lines were refusing to load them, while the Standard and the railroads were doing their utmost to prevent the Equitable line doing business, and were discouraging in every way the seaboard pipe line, new routes which would take care of a proportion at least of the oil which they claimed they could not handle, thousands of barrels of oil were running on the ground in Bradford, and two of the independent refineries of New York shut down entirely in order that a third of their number might get oil enough to fill an order. This interference with the outside interests, thus preventing the small degree of relief which they would have afforded, and a growing conviction that the Standard meant to keep up the immediate shipment order at least until it had built the pipes and tanks needed in the Bradford field, finally aroused the region to a point where riot was imminent. The long line of producers which filed into the United Pipe Line's office day after day to sell their oil at whatever prices they could get for it, and who, having put in an offer which varied according to their necessities, were usually told to come back in 10 days, and the buyer would see whether he wanted it or not. This long line of men began to talk of revolution. Crowds gathered about the offices of the Standard threatening and jeering. Mysterious things, crossbones and death heads, were found plentifully sprinkled on the buildings owned by the Standard interests. More than once the slumber of the oil towns was disturbed by marching bodies of men. It was certain that a species of Ku Klux had hold of the Bradford region, and that a very little spark was needed to touch off the United Pipe Lines. In the meantime, things were scarcely less exciting in the lower fields. The immediate shipment order was looked upon there as particularly outrageous, because there was no lack of lines or tanks in that field, and when in the summer of 1878 there was added to this cause an unjustifiable scarcity of cars, excitement rose to fever heat. Chapter 7, Part 1. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 7, Part 2 of the History of Standard Oil, Volume 1, by Ida Tarbell. Recording by Tom Weiss. The Crisis of 1878. The only thing which prevented a riot at this time, and great destruction of property, if not of life, was the strong hand the Petroleum Producers' Union had on the country. Fearing that if violence did occur, the different movements they had under way would be prejudiced, they sent a committee of 25 men to Harrisburg to see Governor Hartranft. They laid before him and the Attorney General of the state the grievance of the oil producers in an appeal reviewing the history of the industry. They demanded that the United Pipe Lines be made to perform its duty as a public carrier, and the railroads be made to cease their discrimination against shippers both in the matter of rebates and in furnishing cars. They called the Governor's attention to the fact that there were already existing laws touching these matters, which in their judgment met the case, and if the existing laws did not give them relief, that it was the plain duty of the executive to call a meeting of the Legislature and pass such acts as would do so. Governor Hartranft was much stirred by the story of the producers. He went himself to the Oil Regions to see the situation, and in August directed the producers to put their demands into the form of an appeal. This was done, and it was decided to bring proceedings by writ of quo warranto against the United Pipe Lines, and by separate bills in equity against the Pennsylvania Railroad and the other lines doing business in the state. It was September before the state authorities began their investigation of the United Pipe Lines, the hearings being held in Titusville. Many witnesses summoned failed to appear, but enough testimony was brought out in this investigation to show that the railroads had refused to furnish cars for independents when they had them empty, and that the United Pipe Lines had clearly violated its duty as a common carrier. In his report on this investigation, the Secretary of Internal Affairs, William McCandless, rendered a verdict that the charges of the oil producers had not been substantiated in any way that demanded action. The indignation which followed this report was intense. It found a vent in the hanging in effigy of McCandless, who was universally known in the state as Buck. In the Oil Exchange at Parker, on the morning of October 19, the figure of a man was found hanged by the neck to a gallows, and the producers left it hanging there all day so that they might jeer and curse it. Across the forehead of the effigy, in large blood red letters, were the words Pennsylvania Railroad. Pinned to the gallows there was a card bearing a quotation from Secretary McCandless's report. The charges of the oil producers have not been substantiated in any way that demands action. In Bradford a huge effigy hung in the streets all day, and in the village of Tarport, near by, another swayed on the gallows. They pulled down the effigy at Bradford and drew from a pocket what purported to be a check signed by John D. Rockefeller, president of the Standard Oil Company, in favor of Buck McCandless, for $20,000, and endorsed by the Pennsylvania Railroad Company. That represented the price, they said, that McCandless got for signing the report. Throughout the oil country there was hardly an oil producer to be found not associated with the Standard Oil Company who did not believe that McCandless had sold himself and his office to the Standard Oil Combination for $20,000, and used the money to help in his congressional canvass. The excitement in the Oil Regions spread all over the country. Something of the importance the press attached to it may be judged from the way the New York Sun handled the question. For 6 weeks it kept one of the ablest members of its staff in the Oil Regions. 6 columns of the first page of the issue for November 13 was taken up with the story of the excitement, coupled with a full account of the South Improvement Company and the development of the Standard Oil Company out of that concern. On November 23 the first page contained 4 columns more under blazing headlines. Early in 1879 the hearing of the suits in equity brought by the Commonwealth against the various transportation companies, of which the producers had been complaining, were begun. The witnesses subpoenaed failed at first to appear, and when on the stand they frequently refused to reply, but it soon became apparent to them that the state authorities were in earnest, and that they must answer or go to Europe. By March, 1879, an important array of testimony had been brought out. Among the Standard men who had appeared had been John D. Archbold, William Frew, Charles Lockhart, and J. J. Vandergrift. A score or more of producers also appeared. The most important witness from the railroad circles, and indeed the most important witness who appeared, was A. J. Cassatt. Mr. Cassatt's testimony was startling in its candour and its completeness, and substantiated in every particular what the oil men had been claiming: that the Pennsylvania Railroad had become the creature of the Standard Oil Company; that it was not only giving that company rates much lower than to any other organisation, but that it was using its facilities with a direct view of preventing any outside refiner or dealer in oil from carrying on an independent business. The same or similar conditions, not only in oil but in other products which led to these suits, led to investigations in other states. Toward the end of 1878 the Chamber of Commerce of New York City demanded from the Legislature of the state an investigation of the New York railroads. This investigation was carried on from the beginning of 1879. The revelations were amazing. Before the Hepburn Commission, as it was called from the name of the chairman, was through with its work, there had appeared before it to give testimony in regard to the conduct of the Standard Oil Company and of the relation of the Erie and the Central roads to it, H. H. Rogers, J. D. Archbold, Jabez A. Bostwick, and W. T. Scheide. A large number of independent oil men had also appeared. William H. Vanderbilt had been examined, and G. H. Blanchard, the freight agent of the Erie road, had given a full account of the relation of the Erie to the Standard, perhaps the most useful piece of testimony, after that of Mr. Cassatt, belonging to this period of the Standard's history. At the same time that the Pennsylvania suits were going on, and the Hepburn Commission was doing its work, the Legislature of Ohio instituted an investigation. It was commonly charged that this investigation was smothered, but it was not smothered until H. M. Flagler had appeared before it and given some most interesting facts concerning rebates. A number of gentlemen who were finding it hard to do oil business also appeared before the Ohio committee and told their stories. By April, 1879, there had been brought out in these various investigations a mass of testimony sufficient in the judgment of certain of the producers to establish the truth of a charge which they had long been making, and that was that the Standard was simply a revival of the South Improvement Company. Now the verdict of the Congressional Committee had been that the South Improvement Company was a conspiracy. Therefore, said the producers, the Standard Oil Company is a conspiracy. Their hope had been, from the first, to obtain proof to establish this charge. Having this, they believed they could obtain judgment from the courts against the officials of the company, and either break it up or put its members in the penitentiary. The more hot headed of the producers believed they now had this evidence. If one will examine the testimony which had been given thus far in the course of the various examinations, one will see that there was reason for their belief. In the first place, it had been established that all the stockholders of the South Improvement Company, excepting four, were now members of the Standard Oil Combination. Indeed, the only persons holding high positions in the new combination at this date who were not South Improvement Company men were Charles Pratt, J. J. Vandergrift, H. H. Rogers, and John D. Archbold. The South Improvement Company had been a secret organisation. So was the new Standard Alliance. That is, the most strenuous efforts had been made to keep it secret. For instance, the sale of the works of Lockhart, Warden, and Pratt to the Standard was kept from the public. Indeed, it was a year after these sales before even the Erie Railroad knew that Mr. Rockefeller had any affiliations besides those with Pratt and Company, and it made its contracts with him on this assumption. When purchases of refineries were made, it was the custom to continue the business under the name of the original concern. Thus, when Mrs. B. of Cleveland sold in 1878, as recounted in the last chapter, the persons selling were obliged to keep the sale secret even from the employees of the concern. The understanding was with regard to the sale of the property to the Standard Oil Company, said the shipping clerk in his affidavit, that it should not be known outside of their own parties, that it was to be kept a profound secret, and that the business was to be carried on as if the B Oil Company was still a competitor. The secret rights with which the contract was made in 1876 between Mr. Rockefeller and Scofield, Shurmer and Teagle have already been described. To keep the relations of the various Standard concerns secret, Mr. Rockefeller went so far in 1880 as to make an affidavit like the following: It is not true, as stated by Mr. Teagle in his affidavit, that the Standard Oil Company, directly or indirectly through its officers or agents, owns or controls the works of Warden, Frew and Company, Lockhart, Frew and Company, J. A. Bostwick and Company, C. Pratt and Company, Acme Refining Company, Imperial Refining Company, Camden Consolidated Company, and the DeVoe Manufacturing Company. Nor is it true that the Standard Oil Company, directly or indirectly through its officers or agents, owns or controls the refinery at Hunters Point, New York. It is not true that the Standard Oil Company, directly or indirectly through its officers or agents, purchased or acquired the Empire Transportation Company, or furnished the money therefor. Nor is it true that the Standard Oil Company inaugurated, or began or induced any other person or corporation to inaugurate or begin a war upon the Pennsylvania Railroad Company or the Empire Transportation Company, as stated in the affidavit of Mr. Teagle. There may be a technical explanation of this affidavit, although the writer knows of none. There is certainly abundant testimony in existence that the works of Messrs. Pratt, Lockhart and Warden at least had been bought long before this affidavit was made and paid for in Standard Oil Company stock, and that they were working in alliance with that company. It was shown in the last chapter that on October 17, 1877, the Standard Oil paid $2,500,000 in certified checks on the purchasing price of the plant of the Empire Transportation Company. While none of the other members of the Standard Oil Company examined in 1879 was quite so sweeping in his denials, all of them evaded direct answers. The reason they gave for this evasion was that the investigations were an interference with their rights as private citizens, and that the government had no business to inquire into their methods. Consequently, when asked questions, they refused to answer by advice of counsel. Ultimately, the gentlemen did answer a great many questions. But taking the testimony all in all, through these years, it certainly is a mild characterisation to say that it totally lacks in frankness. The testimony of the Standard officials before the Hepburn Commission was so evasive that the committee, in making its report, spoke bitterly of the company as a mysterious organisation whose business and transactions are of such a character that its members decline giving a history or description of it lest this testimony be used to convict them of a crime. The producers certainly were right in claiming that secrecy was a characteristic of the Standard, as it had been of the South Improvement Company. The new Standard Combination, like the South Improvement Company, aimed at controlling the entire refining interest. "The coal oil business belongs to us," Mr. Rockefeller once told a recalcitrant refiner. His associates were saying the same on all sides. "The object of the Standard Oil Company is to secure the entire refining business of the world," a member of the concern told B. F. Nye, an Ohio producer. The method the Standard depended upon to secure this control was the same as the method of the South Improvement Company — special privileges in transportation. We have seen how intelligently and persistently Mr. Rockefeller worked to secure these special privileges until, in 1877, he had made with all the trunk lines contracts which in every particular paralleled the contracts which in January, 1872, Messrs. Scott, Gould, Vanderbilt and McClellan made with the South Improvement Company. He now had a rebate on every barrel of oil he shipped, and this was given with the understanding that the railroad should allow no rebate to any other shipper unless that shipper could guarantee and furnish a quantity of oil for shipment which would, after deduction of his commission, realise to the road the same amount of profit realised from the Standard trade. He also had a drawback on every barrel his rival shipped. No clause in the South Improvement Company's contract with railroads had given more offence to the oil world than that which called for a drawback to the company on the oil shipped by outsiders. It will be remembered that the beneficiaries of this contract were to receive drawbacks of $1.06 a barrel on all crude oil that outside parties shipped from the Oil Regions to New York, and a proportionate drawback on that shipped from other points. The rebate system was considered illegal and unjust, but men were more or less accustomed to it. The drawback on other people's shipment was a new device, and it threw the Oil Region into a frenzy of rage. It did not seem possible that the Standard would attempt to revive this practice again, and yet when it had got its hands strongly on the Ford trunk lines it made a demand for the drawback. It has already been recounted how, on February 5, 1878, 4 months after the Pennsylvania succumbed to the Standard's demand, Mr. O'Day wrote to Mr. Cassatt: "I here repeat what I once stated to you, and which I wish you to receive and treat as strictly confidential, that we have been for many months receiving from the New York Central and Erie railroads certain sums of money, in no instance less than 20 cents per barrel, on every barrel of crude oil carried by each of these roads. Co operating as we are doing with the Standard Oil Company and the trunk lines in every effort to secure for the railroads paying rates of freight on the oil they carry, I am constrained to say to you that in justice to the interests I represent, we should receive from your company at least 20 cents on each barrel of crude oil you transport." And Mr. Cassatt, after seeing the freight bills showing that both the Central and Erie allowed a drawback, gave orders that the Pennsylvania pay one of 22½ cents. When Mr. Cassatt was under examination in 1874, the examiner remarked: "I understand, Mr. Cassatt, that this 22½ cents paid to the American Transfer Company is not restricted to all oil that passed through their lines." "No, sir. It is paid on all oil received and transferred by us." Among the interesting documents presented at this inquiry was a statement of the crude oil shipments over the Pennsylvania road for February and March, 1878. They footed up to a total of 343,767½ barrels. On this amount a discount of 20 cents a barrel was allowed to the Standard Oil Company through its agent, the American Transfer Company. Among other agents who shipped this oil was H. C. Ohlen. In all, Mr. Ohlen shipped 29,876 barrels, and on this the Standard Oil Company received 20 cents a barrel. That is, after Mr. Ohlen had paid for his oil, paid for having it carried by the pipe line to the railroad, and paid the railroad the full rate of freight without the commission the Standard received, the Pennsylvania was obliged to turn over to the Standard Oil Company 20 cents of the amount he had paid on each barrel. The examiner tried very hard to find out if there was a legitimate question why such an allowance should have been made to the American Transfer Company on oil it did not handle. "We pay that," Mr. Cassatt said, "as a commission to them to aid in securing us our share of the trade. We pay it," said the comptroller, "for procuring oil to go over the lines in which the Pennsylvania Railroad is interested as against the New York lines and the New York Central." "Do you understand," the examiner questioned of one of the auditors, "that the American Transfer Company secured to the Pennsylvania road the traffic of the outside refiners of New York, mentioned in the statement quoted above?" "I never raised a question of that kind in my mind," answered the adroit auditor. But the answer was evident. The American Transfer Company had nothing whatever to do with the oil shipped by Mr. Ohlen or Ayres, Lombard and Company, or J. Rousseau, or any one of the other independents mentioned in the statement, unless perchance that oil had come originally from the lines of the American Transfer Company. In that case the shipper had paid the line for the service rendered at the time he bought the oil, the custom then and now. The tax was paid by the Pennsylvania solely because the Standard Oil Company had the power to demand it. The demand was made in the name of the American Transfer Company as a blind. Naturally, the proof that the Standard had revived the most obnoxious feature of the South Improvement Company aroused intense bitterness and disgust among the oil men. Another offensive clause of the 1872 contracts was that pledging the railroads to lower or raise the gross rates of transportation for such times and to such extent as might be necessary to overcome competition. Now, the new contracts of the Standard provided the same arrangement. That is, they stipulated that the rates were to be lowered if necessary, so as to place the Standard on a parity with shippers by competing lines. The workings of the clause were illustrated when the producers got the Equitable Line through in 1878, the railroads dropping their charge to 80 cents a barrel, and in some cases even less. The producers certainly had evidence enough for their claim that the contracts of the South Improvement Company and the Standard Oil Company with the railroads were similar in every particular as far as principles were concerned, that they differed alone in the amounts of the rebates and drawbacks. There was plenty of evidence brought out also to show that the object of the Standard operations was like that of the South Improvement Company, keeping up the price of refined oil. Both combinations were formed to keep the refined article scarce on the market by controlling all the refineries and by refusing to sell under competition. The officials of the South Improvement Company stated under oath that they had hoped to raise the price 50%. The central organisation hoped to put up the price of refined from 15 to 25 cents. As a matter of fact, that organisation, when it finally got control of the market, put up the price considerably more. The spectacular demonstration in the winter of 1876 and 1877 of what could be done in keeping up the price of refined was still rankling in the minds of the oil men. They saw that it was by that coup that the Standard had gotten the ready money to pay for the plant of the Empire Transportation Company, the money to buy in whatever it wanted, the money to pay the 50% dividend to which one of its members testified in the Ohio investigation. They remembered that while the refiners had been selling refined around 30 cents a gallon, they had sold crude at less than $4 a barrel. Little wonder then that they felt they had evidence that the Standard had actually done what they had always claimed it would do if it got hold of the refining interest as it planned. Even in the case where certain large producers had entered into a partnership with the Standard on condition that they paid them prices for crude commensurate with the price of refined, these producers claimed the agreement had not been kept. One of these cases came to light in a suit instituted in 1878. It seems that sometime in December, 1874, the large oil company of H. L. Taylor and Company sold one half interest in its property to the Standard Oil Company. The reason for the sale the plaintiffs stated in their complaint to be as follows: the extent of the Standard's business and control over pipe lines and refineries had enabled them to procure, and they had procured from the railways, more favourable terms for transportation than others could obtain. These advantages and facilities placed it within their power to obtain, and they did obtain, far better and more uniform prices for petroleum than could be obtained by the plaintiffs. The said organisation and firms, by virtue of their monopoly of the business of refining and transportation of oil, had been at times almost the only buyers in the market, and at such times had been enabled to dictate and establish a price for crude oil far below its actual value, as determined by prices of refined oil at same dates, and they thus obtained a large share of the profits which should have fallen to the plaintiff and other purchasers. The sale was made, and in consideration of the foregoing premises, and upon the promise and agreement on the part of the defendants that the partnership thus formed should have the benefit of the advantage and facilities of the said defendants and the organisations and firms managed and controlled by defendants in marketing its oil; that the firm should have, to the extent of its production, the advantage of the sales of refined by the defendants or said Standard Oil Company, either for present or future delivery, so that there should be at no time any margin or difference between the ruling price of refined oil and the price which defendants would pay the partnership for crude by it produced, beyond the necessary cost of refining. This thing formed the inducement and the larger part of the consideration for the sale of said property to the defendants. The amount actually received for said interest was far beneath its actual value, and without the agreement on the part of the defendants to pay to the partnership for its product prices at all times commensurate with the prices of refined oil, they would not have sold the said interest nor entered into said partnership. The defendants, also requested to do so, have not only failed, neglected, and refused to comply with this agreement, but have, by false and erroneous statements, misled the plaintiffs and induced them to consent to the sale to them and to the Standard Oil Company of large quantities of crude petroleum produced by the partnership at prices far below its actual value, to the great loss and damage of the orators. That on or about December 6, 1876, refined was selling at a price equivalent to $7 for crude oil, at which time plaintiffs called upon defendants for a compliance with their agreement, and asked that they take or purchase 210,000 barrels of the production of the partnership at a price commensurate with the price of refined at that time. This defendants neglected and refused to do, and the partnership was forced to sell the same at prices varying from $3 to $4, making a loss to the partnership upon this one transaction of from $600,000 to $1,000,000, for which said defendants neglect and refuse to account. That the said defendants for themselves and for the said Standard Oil Company and other organisations and firms aforesaid have since the formation of the partnership received from the railways a rebate or drawback in the shape of wheelage or otherwise at times as high as $1 per barrel upon all oil shipped by them to the seaboard; that instead of using these advantages which they possess for the benefit and profit of the partnership, as they covenanted to do, they have used them against its interests by restraining trade, preventing competition, and forcing plaintiffs to accept any price which defendants, the said Standard Oil Company, or the other organisations aforesaid might offer for their production; that the amount of oil produced and sold by the partnership for the 3 years beginning with the date of its formation and ending December 1, 1877, was 2,657,830 barrels of oil; that the profits of defendants upon oil refined by them during said period, taking into consideration the rebates and drawbacks received from the railways, have averaged at least $1 per barrel over and above the cost of refining, and at times as high as $4 and $5. That these profits under the partnership agreement that no margin should exist between crude and refined prices should to the extent of the production of the partnership have been paid by defendants to the partnership; that the amount lost by the partnership and realised by the defendants, by reason of the failure and refusal of said defendants to comply with their agreement, is not less than $2,500,000, for one half of which defendants should account to your orators, but which they neglect and refuse to do so. Naturally enough, the producers now pointed out that the case of the H. L. Taylor Company was a demonstration of what they had claimed in 1872, when the South Improvement Company, alarmed at the uprising, offered them a contract, and what they had always claimed since when the Standard Oil offered contracts for oil on a sliding scale, viz., that such contracts were never meant to be kept; that they were a blind to enable the Standard to make scoops such as they had made in the winter of 1876 and 1877. Taking all these points into consideration: First, that the Standard Oil Company, like the South Improvement Company, was a secret organisation. Second, that both companies were composed in the main of the same parties. Third, that it aimed, like its predecessors, at getting entire control of the refining interests. Fourth, that it used the power the combination gave it to get rebates on its own oil shipments and drawbacks on the shipments of other people. Fifth, that it had arranged contracts which compelled the railroads to run out all competition by lowering their rates. Sixth, that it aimed to put up the price of refined without allowing the producer a share of the profits. Taking all these points into consideration, many of the producers, including the president of the Petroleum Producers' Union, B. B. Campbell, and certain members of his council, came to the conclusion that as they had sufficient evidence against the members of the Standard Combination to insure conviction for criminal conspiracy, they should proceed against them. Strenuous opposition to the proceedings, as hastily and ill advised, developed in the council and the legal committee, but the majority decided that the prosecution should be instituted. Mr. Scott and Mr. Cassatt were omitted from the proposed indictment on the ground that they were already weary of the Standard and would cease their illegal practices gladly if they could. On the 29th day of April, 1879, the grand jury of the county of Clarion found an indictment against John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, Jabez A. Bostwick, Daniel O'Day, William G. Warden, Charles Lockhart, Henry M. Flagler, Jacob J. Vandergrift, and George W. Girty. Girty was the cashier of the Standard Oil Company. There were 8 counts in the indictment, and charged in brief a conspiracy for the purpose of securing a monopoly of the business of buying and selling crude petroleum, and to prevent others than themselves from buying and selling and making a legitimate profit thereby; a combination to oppress and injure those engaged in producing petroleum; a conspiracy to prevent others than themselves from engaging in the business of refining petroleum, and to secure a monopoly of that business for themselves; a combination to injure the carrying trade of the Allegheny Valley and Pennsylvania Railroad Companies, by preventing them from receiving the natural petroleum traffic; to divert the traffic naturally belonging to the Pennsylvania carriers to those of other states by unlawful means; and to extort from railroad companies unreasonable rebates and commissions, and by fraudulent means and devices to control the market prices of crude and refined petroleum and acquire unlawful gains thereby. 4 of the persons mentioned in the indictment, Messrs. O'Day, Warden, Lockhart, and Vandergrift, all citizens of Pennsylvania, gave bail, and early in June application was made to Governor Hoyt of Pennsylvania to issue a requisition before the Governor of New York for the extradition of the other 5 gentlemen. With damaging testimony piling up day by day in 3 states, and with an indictment for conspiracy hanging over the heads of himself and 8 of his associates, matters looked gloomy for John D. Rockefeller in the spring of 1879. The good of the oil business certainly seemed to be in danger. Chapter 7. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com. Chapter 8 of the History of Standard Oil, Volume 1, by Ida M. Tarbell. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by Tom Weiss. Chapter 8. The Compromise of 1880. No doubt the indictment of Mr. Rockefeller in the spring of 1879 seemed to him the work of malice and spite. By 7 years of persistent effort he had worked out a well conceived plan for controlling the oil business of the United States. Another year, and he had reason to believe that the remnant of refiners who still rebelled against his intentions would either be convinced or dead, and he could rule unimpeded. But here, at the very threshold of empire, a certain group of people with a private grievance, mossbacks naturally left in the lurch by the progress of this rapidly developing trade, his colleagues described them to the Hepburn Commission, stood in his way. "You have taken deliberate advantage of the iniquitous practices of the railroads to build up a monopoly," they told him. "We combined to overthrow those practices so far as the oil business was concerned. You not only refused to support us in this contention, you persuaded or forced the railroads to make you the only recipient of their illegal favors. More than that, you developed the unjust practices, forcing them into forms unheard of before. Not only have you secured rebates of extraordinary value on all your own shipments, you have persuaded the railroads to give you a commission on the oil that other people ship. You are guilty of plotting against the prosperity of an industry." And they indicted him, with 8 of his colleagues, for conspiracy. The evidence on which the oil men based this serious charge has already been analysed. At the moment they brought their suit for conspiracy, what was their situation? They had, several months before, driven the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania to bring suits against 4 railroads operating within its borders, and against the Standard pipe lines for infringing their duties as common carriers. Partial testimony had been taken in the case against the Pennsylvania Road, and in that against the United Pipe Lines. These suits, though far from finished, had given the Producers' Union the bulk of the proof on which they had secured the indictment of the Standard officials for conspiracy. Now, since the railroads and the pipe lines were the guilty ones, that is, as it was they who had granted the illegal favors, and as they were the only ones that could surely be convicted, it seems clear that the only wise course for the producers would have been to prosecute energetically and exclusively these first suits. But evident as the necessity for such persistency was, and just after Mr. Cassatt had startled the public and given the Union material with which it certainly in time could have compelled the Commonwealth to a complete investigation, the producers interrupted their work by bringing their spectacular suit for conspiracy. A suit which perhaps might have been properly instituted after the others had been completed, but which, introduced now, completely changed the situation, for it gave the witnesses from whom they were most anxious to hear a loophole for escape. For instance, the officials of the Standard pipe lines had been instructed to appear on the 14th of May, 1879, to answer questions which earlier in the trial they had refused to answer on advice of counsel. Now the president of the United Pipe Lines, J. J. Vandergrift, and the general manager, Daniel O'Day, were both included in the indictment for conspiracy. The evening before the interrogatory the producers' counsel received a telegram from the attorney general of the state, announcing that the pipe line people were complaining that the testimony which they would be called on to give on the morrow would be used against them in the conspiracy trial, as it undoubtedly would have been, and that he thought it only fair that their hearing be postponed until after that suit. And so the defendants gained time, the chief desideratum of defendants who do not wish to fight. Soon after, the conspiracy case was again used to excellent advantage by the Standard people in the investigation which was being conducted in New York before the Hepburn Commission. Mr. Bostwick, the Standard Oil buyer, whose order to buy immediate shipment oil only at a discount had been one of the oil men's chief grievances for a year and a half, was summoned as a witness. But Mr. Bostwick, too, was under indictment for conspiracy, and when the examiners began to put questions to him which the producers were eager to have answered, he asked: "How can I, a man soon to be tried for conspiracy, be expected to answer these questions? I shall incriminate myself." He was sustained in his plea, and about all the Hepburn Commission got out of him was: "I refuse to answer, lest I incriminate myself." This, then, was the first fruit of the producers' hasty and vindictive suit. It had shut the mouths of the important Standard witnesses. Discouraging as this discovery was, however, there was no reason why the suits against the railroads should not have been pushed through, and the testimony the officials unquestionably could be made to give, now that Mr. Cassatt had set the pace, have been obtained. But the Producers' Union had lost sight for the moment of the fact that the fundamental difficulty in the trouble was the illegal discrimination of the common carriers. The Union was so much more eager to punish Mr. Rockefeller than it was to punish the railroads, that in bringing the suit for conspiracy it was even guilty of leniency towards the officials of the Pennsylvania. Certainly, if there was to be an indictment for conspiracy, all the supposed conspirators should have been included. It was by discriminations clearly contrary to the constitution of the state that the Pennsylvania Railroad had made it possible for Mr. Rockefeller
to achieve his monopoly in Pennsylvania. The Union had proof of these rebates, but they let off Mr. Scott and Mr. Cassatt because they professed the greatest desire to get rid of Standard domination, and were loudly asserting that they had been victimised and compelled at times to carry oil freights at less than cost. Evidently the fate of the settlement the oil men had made 7 years before with Mr. Scott and the presidents of the other oil bearing roads had been forgotten. Naturally enough, the railroads took advantage of these signs of leniency on the part of the producers, and brought all their enormous influence to bear on the state authorities to delay hearings and bring about a settlement. The Pennsylvania secured delays up to December, 1879, and then the governor ordered the attorney general to stop proceedings against the road until the testimony had been taken in the other 4 cases. That is, in the cases against 1. the United Pipe Lines, 2. the Lake Shore and Michigan Southern, 3. the Dunkirk, Allegheny and Pittsburgh, and 4. the Atlantic and Great Western. It was a heavy blow to the Union, for at the moment its hands were tied by the conspiracy case, as far as the United Pipe Lines were concerned, and the 3 railroads were foreign corporations only having branches in Pennsylvania, and accordingly very difficult to reach. The testimony could have been obtained, however, if the Union had been undivided in its interest. It would have been done, of course, if the state authorities had been willing to do what was their obvious duty. But the state authorities really asked nothing better than to escape further prosecution of the railroads. The administration was Republican, the governor being Henry M. Hoyt. Mr. Hoyt had been elected in the fall of 1878, and so had inherited the suits from Governor Hartranft. He was pledged, however, to see them through, for before the election the Producers' Union had sent him the following letter: Titusville, October 23, 1878. Henry M. Hoyt. Sir, during the past few months the Association of Producers of Petroleum, long oppressed in their immediate business and kindred industries by the persistent disregard of law by certain great corporations exercising their powers within the state of Pennsylvania, and daily subjected to incalculable loss by a powerful and corrupt combination of these corporations and individuals, have appealed to the executive, legislative and judiciary branches of the government for relief and protection. The questions which they raise for the consideration of the authorities and the people affect not only themselves, but the whole public, not only the particular calling in which they are engaged, but nearly all kinds of business in the commonwealth and the nation. The Legislature has not responded to the demands made that the provisions of the Constitution shall be speedily enforced by appropriate legislation. The present executive has caused proceedings to be instituted in the courts looking to relief, if it can be had by process of law, and these are still pending while others may be begun. In view of the grave duties which will devolve upon you, should you be chosen to the high office to which you aspire, in behalf of the Petroleum Producers' Association, I ask from you a definite expression of your views upon the following subjects: First, will you, if elected, recommend to the Legislature the passage of laws to carry into effect the 3rd and 12th sections of the 16th and the 3rd, 7th and 12th sections of the 17th articles of the Constitution of Pennsylvania? Second, if such laws should be passed as referred to in the preceding question, will you, as Governor, approve them if constitutional? Third, will you, as Governor, recommend and approve such other remedial legislation as may be required to cure the evils set forth in a memorial to Governor Hartranft of August 15, 1878? Fourth, in the selection of the law officer of the state, will you, if elected, secure the services of one who will prosecute with vigour all proceedings already commenced or that may be instituted, having in view the subjection of corporations to the laws of the land? Very respectfully, A. N. Perrin, Chairman Committee. Governor Hoyt's answers were eminently satisfactory. There were provisions in the Constitution, he wrote, intended to compel the railroad and canal companies of the state to the performance of their duties as common carriers with fairness and equality, without discrimination, to all persons doing business over their lines. This policy is just and right. If called to a position requiring official action, I would recommend and approve any legislation necessary and appropriate to carry into effect the sections of the Constitution referred to. It would be my duty, if elected, to see that no citizen, or class of citizens even, were subjected to hardship or injustice in their business by illegal acts of corporations or others where relief lay within executive control. Any proper measures or legislation which would effectually remedy the grievances set forth in the memorial addressed to Governor Hartranft would receive my recommendation and approval. It would be my duty, if elected, to select only officers as would enforce obedience to the Constitution and laws, both by corporations and individuals, without fear or favour, and all such officers would be held by me to strict accountability for the full and prompt discharge of all their official duties. Governor Hoyt had indeed begun the suits, all of the testimony in regard to the Pennsylvania having been taken in his administration. This testimony must have proved to him that the transgressions of the road had been far more flagrant than anyone dreamed of, that they had amounted simply to driving certain men out of business in order to build up the business of certain other men. His evident duty, as his letter to the producers shows clearly enough that he realised, was to push the suits against the railroads, even if the oil men entirely withdrew. But instead of that it became evident in the spring that he was using every opportunity to delay. Indeed, one reason the producers gave for bringing the conspiracy suit was that it would give the state authorities a scapegoat, that they would gladly act vigorously against the Standard if they were let off from prosecuting the Pennsylvania. Governor Hoyt now availed himself fully of the vacillation of the Union toward the railroads, using it as an excuse for not prosecuting the railroad cases. But if the producers were half-hearted toward the railroads, they were whole-hearted enough toward the Standard. In spite of the fact that they had gotten in their own way, so to speak, by bringing their conspiracy suit, they felt convinced that they had enough material to win it on, and they sought the extradition of the non-residents who had been indicted. Early in June, Governor Hoyt was called upon to issue a requisition for the extradition of John D. Rockefeller, William Rockefeller, H. M. Flagler, J. A. Bostwick, Daniel O'Day, Charles Pratt, and G. W. Girty. A full agreement was made before the state officials, but a decision was deferred repeatedly. Finally, worn out with waiting, Mr. Campbell, in a telegram to the Governor on July 29, threatened, if there was longer delay, to make his request for extradition through the public press. The answer from Harrisburg was that the attorney general was sick and could not attend to the matter. Mr. Campbell wired back that he was tired of addition, division, and silence, and he sent out the following letter: Fairfield, July 31, 1879. To His Excellency Henry M. Hoyt, Governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Sir, on behalf of the producers of oil, whom I represent as President of their General Council, I most respectfully ask a decision at your hands of the requisition on the Governor of the State of New York for the surrender of the officers of the Standard Oil Company, indicted by the Grand Jury of Clarion County, and now believed to be within limits of the State of New York. The case was exhaustively argued before you more than 4 weeks ago, and the great oil interest which I have the honour to represent has a right to a prompt decision on this vital question. If these parties, who for their own profit and its ruin control Pennsylvania's most valuable product, and compel its greatest carrier to undertake their warfare and to do their bidding at the sacrifice of its innocent stockholders, can, under the plea of being aliens, defy the law of Pennsylvania and laugh at our impotent attempts to reach them, the sooner it is known, the better. It is possible that if we are denied protection within the limits of our Commonwealth, we may obtain justice by appealing to the courts of a sister state, where at least the defendants will be obliged to admit that they are residents. Your obedient servant, B. B. Campbell, President of Producers' Council. The Governor remained obdurate, nor was the request ever granted. In a message sent out in January, 1881, Governor Hoyt gave a review of the case, as he was compelled to do, so great was the popular criticism of his course in not pushing the suits and in refusing the request for extradition, in which he attributed his refusal to the negotiations begun between the railroads and the Producers' Union. The writer has examined all the private correspondence which passed at this time between the litigants, but finds no proof of Governor Hoyt's statement that the Union at one time ceased its demands for Mr. Rockefeller's extradition. The conspiracy suit had been set for the August session of the Clarion County Court. When August came, the Standard sought a continuance, and it was granted. The delay did not in any way discourage the producers, and when Mr. Rockefeller became convinced of this, he tried conciliation. "Come, let us reason together," has always been a favourite proposition of Mr. Rockefeller. He would rather persuade than coerce, rather silence than fight. He had been making peace overtures ever since the suits began. The first had been in the fall of 1878, soon after they were instituted, when he sent the following letter to Captain Vandergrift: Captain J. J. Vandergrift: My dear Sir, we are now prepared to enter into a contract to refine all the petroleum that can be sold in the markets of the world at a low price for refining. Prices of refined oil to be made by a joint committee of producers and refiners, and the profits to be determined by these. Profits to be divided equitably between both parties. This joint interest to have the lowest net rates obtainable from railroads. If your judgment approves, you may consult some of the producers upon this question. This would probably require the United Pipe Lines to make contracts and act as a clearing house for both parties. Very respectfully yours, J. D. Rockefeller. Captain Vandergrift handed the letter to the executive committee of the Producers' Union. It was returned to him without a reply. The producers had tried an arrangement of this kind with Mr. Rockefeller's National Refiners' Association in the winter of 1872 and 1873, and it had failed. The refiners had thrown up their contract when they found they could get all the oil they wanted at a lower price than they had contracted to pay the Producers' Union, from men who had not gone into that organisation. The oil country was familiar, too, with the case of the H. L. Taylor Company, whose complaint against the Standard was referred to in the last chapter. Contracts of that sort were never meant to be kept, they declared. They were meant as SOPs, opiates. In November, 1878, after the testimony which had been brought out by the suit against the United Pipe Lines had been pretty well aired in the New York Sun and other papers, and one or two private suits against the railroads were creating a good deal of public discussion, an effort to secure a conference between the representatives of the Union and the Standard officials was made. The Union refused to go into it officially. A meeting was held, however, in New York on November 29, at which several well known oil men were present. It was announced to the press in advance that it was to be an important but secret meeting between the oil producers, refiners, and Standard men; that its object was to settle all grievances and to secure a withdrawal of the impending suits. As soon as the news of this proposed meeting reached the Oil Regions, the officials of the Union promptly denied their connection with it. Although these early efforts to get a wedge into the Producers' Union and thus secure a staying of the suits had no results, the Standard was not discouraged. It never is. There is no evidence in its history that it knows what the word means. Not being able to handle the Union as a whole, the Standard began working on individuals. By March, 1879, the idea of a compromise had become particularly strong in Oil City. Indeed, one of the several reasons advanced for bringing the conspiracy suits was that such a proceeding would defeat the efforts the Oil City branch were making to bring about a settlement with Mr. Rockefeller. Accordingly, when it became apparent to Mr. Rockefeller in the fall of 1879 that the producers meant to fight through the conspiracy suit, though they might dally over the others, he notified Roger Sherman, counsel for the Union, that he wished to lay before him a proposition looking to a settlement. The president, Mr. Campbell, was in favour of receiving the proposition. "I have no idea they will present anything we can accept," he wrote Mr. Sherman. "Still, it will furnish a first-rate gauge to test how badly they are scared." And the Standard was told that the Union would consider what they had to offer. "But it is a serious question, this of settlement," replied Mr. Rockefeller. "Our trial is set for October 28. We cannot get ready for that and prepare a proposition too. Why not postpone the trial?" This was done, December 15 being set. But no proposition was made to the producers for over 6 weeks. Then they were asked to meet the Standard men on November 29 in New York City. Piqued at the delay, the producers informed the Standard that they could no longer consider their proposition, and that the trial would be pushed. But again the Standard secured delay, this time by petitioning that the case be argued before the Supreme Court of the state. They declared that such was the state of public feeling in Clarion County that they could not obtain justice there. They charged the judges with bias and prejudice, declared secret societies were working against them, and called attention to the civil suits which were still hanging fire. Over this petition serious trouble arose in court. There was a wrangle between the judge and the Standard's counsel. The newspapers took it up. The whole state divided itself into camps, and the case was again postponed, this time until the first of the year. Postponement obtained, compromise was again proposed upon the basis of abandonment of all those methods of doing business which the producers claimed injured them, and as a mark of their sincerity the United Pipe Lines on December 24, 1879, issued an order announcing the abandonment of immediate shipment throughout the region. A meeting between the legal advisers of the two parties to discuss the proposed terms was arranged for January 7, 1880, at the Fifth Avenue Hotel in New York City, the very time to which the trial of the case for conspiracy had been postponed. It was hardly to be expected that when such negotiations were going on in New York, the trial in Clarion County would be pushed very briskly. It was not. There was a hitch again, and for the fourth time proceedings were stayed. The conferences, however, went on. These negotiations with the Standard continued for a month, and then, early in February, Mr. Campbell, the president of the union, called a meeting of the Grand Council for February 19, 1880, in Titusville, Pennsylvania. For several weeks the Oil Regions had known that President Campbell and Roger Sherman, the leading lawyer of the union, were in conference with the Standard officials. It was rumored that they were arranging a compromise, and it was suspected that the meeting now called was to consider the terms. Naturally, the proposition to be made was looked for with suspicion and curiosity. The meeting was the largest the Grand Council had held for many months. It was supposed to be secret, like all gatherings of the union, but before the first session was over, the word spread over the Oil Regions that Mr. Campbell had brought to the meeting contracts with both Mr. Rockefeller and Mr. Scott, and that they were receiving harsh criticism from the Grand Council. The very meagre accounts which exist of this gathering, historic in oil annals, show that it was one of the most exciting which was ever held in the country, and one can well believe this when one considers the bitter pill the Council was asked to swallow that day. Mr. Campbell began the session by reporting that all the suits at which they had been labouring for nearly 2 years had been withdrawn, and that in return for their withdrawal the Standard and the Pennsylvania Railroad officials had signed contracts to cease certain of the practices of which the producers complained. The Standard contract, which Mr. Campbell then presented, pledged Mr. Rockefeller and some 16 associates, whose names were attached to the document, to the following policy: 1. They would hereafter make no opposition to an entire abrogation of the system of rebates, drawbacks, and secret rates of freight in the transportation of petroleum on the railroads. 2. They withdrew their opposition to secrecy in rate making. That is, they promised they would not hereafter receive any rebate or drawback that the railroad company was not at liberty to make known and to give to other shippers of petroleum. 3. They abandoned entirely the policy which they had been pursuing in the management of the United Pipe Lines. That is, they promised that there should be no discrimination whatever hereafter between their patrons, that the rates should be reasonable and not advanced except on 30 days' notice, that they would make no difference between the price of crude in different districts, excepting such as might be properly based upon the difference in the quality of the oil, that they would receive, transport, store, and deliver all oil tendered to them up to a production of 65,000 barrels a day, and if the production should exceed that amount, they agreed that they would not purchase any so-called immediate shipment oil at a discount on the price of certificate oil. 4. They promised hereafter that when certificates had been given for oil taken into the custody of the pipe lines, the transfer of these certificates should be considered as a delivery of the oil, and the tankage of the seller would be treated as free. Mr. Rockefeller also agreed in making this contract to pay the Producers' Union $40,000 to cover the expense of their litigation. In return for this money, and for the abandonment of secret rebates, and of the pipe line policy to which he had held so strenuously, what was he to receive? He was not to be tried for conspiracy. And that day, after the contract had been presented to the Grand Council, Mr. Campbell sent the following telegram: Titusville, February 19, 1880. To His Excellency Henry M. Hoyt, Governor of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. Sir: As prosecutor in the case of the Commonwealth vs. J. D. Rockefeller, number 25, April Sessions of Clarion County, I consent to the withdrawal of the requisition asked of you for extradition of J. D. Rockefeller et al., the same having been in your hands undecided since July last, and a nolle prosequi having been entered by leave of court of Clarion County in the case, and I will request William L. Hindman, the prosecuting attorney, to forward a formal withdrawal. Your obedient servant, B. B. Campbell. The contract which was signed by Mr. Scott agreed, in consideration of the withdrawal of the suit against the road, to the following policy: 1. That it would make known to all shippers all rates of freight charged upon petroleum. This was an abolition of secret rates. 2. If any rates of freight were allowed one shipper as against another, on demand that rate was to be made known. 3. There should be no longer any discrimination in the allotment and distribution of cars to shippers of petroleum. 4. Any rebate allowed to a large shipper was to be reasonable. There were both humiliation and bitterness in the council when the report was read. Humiliation and bitterness that after 2 years of such strenuous fighting, all that was achieved was a contract which sacrificed what everybody knew to be the fundamental principle, the principle which up to this point the producers had always insisted must be recognised in any negotiation, that the rebate system was wrong and must not be compromised with. Hard speeches were made, and Mr. Campbell's head was bowed more than once while big tears ran down his cheeks. He had worked long and hard. Probably most of the members of the Grand Council who were present had a consciousness that no one of them had done anywhere near what Mr. Campbell had done toward prosecuting their case, and though they might object to the compromise, they could not blame him, knowing all the difficulties which had been put in the way. So they accepted the report, thanking him for his fidelity and energy, but not failing to express their disapproval of the reservation in regard to the rebate system. They ended their meeting by a resolution bitterly condemning the courts, the state administration at Harrisburg, and corporations in general. We declare that by the inefficiency and weakness of the Secretary of Internal Affairs in the year 1878, by the interposition on more than one occasion of the Attorney General in 1879, by which the taking of testimony was prevented, by the failure of the present government for many months either to grant or deny the requisition for criminals indicted for crime within the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania fugitives to other states, and by the interference of some of the judges of the Supreme Court by an extraordinary and, according to the best legal judgment of the land, unlawful proceeding, by which the trial of an indictment for misdemeanor pending in a local court was delayed and prevented, the alarming and most dangerous influence of powerful corporations has been demonstrated. While we accept the inevitable result forced upon us by these influences, we aver that the contest is not over and our objects not attained. But we all continue to advocate and maintain the subordination of all corporations to the laws, the Constitution, and the will of the people, however and whenever expressed. That the system of freight discrimination by common carriers is absolutely wrong in principle, and tends to the fostering of dangerous monopolies, and that it is the duty of the government, by legislation and executive action, to protect the people from their growing and dangerous power. And with this resolution the second Petroleum Producers' Union, formed to fight Mr. Rockefeller, came to an end. By the morning of February 20 the Oil Regions knew of the compromise. The news was received in sullen anger. It was due to the cowardice of the state officials, the corrupting influence of corporations, the oil men said. They blamed everybody but themselves. And yet if they had done their duty the suits would never have been compromised. The simple fact is that the mass of oil men had not stood by their leaders in the hard fight they had been making. These leaders, Mr. Campbell the president, Mr. Sherman the chief counsel, and Mr. Patterson the head of the legislative committee, had given almost their entire time for 2 years to the work of the Union. The offices of Mr. Campbell and Mr. Patterson were both honorary, and they had both often used their private funds in prosecuting their work. Mr. Sherman gave his services for months at a time without pay. No one outside of the Council of the Union knew the stress that came upon these three men. Up to the decision to institute the conspiracy suit they had worked in harmony. But when that was decided upon, Mr. Patterson withdrew. He saw how fatal such a move must be, how completely it interfered with the real work of the Union, forcing common carriers to do their duty. He saw that the substantial steps gained were given up, and that the work would all have to be done over again if their suit went on. Mr. Campbell believed in it, however, and Mr. Sherman, whether he believed in it or not, saw no way but to follow his chief. The 9 months of disappointment and disillusion which followed were terrible for both men. They soon saw that the forces against them were too strong, that they would never in all probability be able to get the conspiracy suit tried, and that so long as it was on the docket the proper witnesses could not be secured for the suits against the railroads. Finally it came to be a question with them what out of the wreck of their plans and hopes could they save, and they saved what the compromise granted. If the oil producers they represented, a body of some 2,000 men, had stood behind them throughout 1879 as they did in 1878, the results would have been different. Their power, their means, were derived from this body, and this body for many months had been giving them feeble support. Scattered as they were over a great stretch of country, interested in nothing but their own oil farms, the producers could only be brought into an alliance by hope of overturning disastrous business conditions. They all felt that the monopoly the Standard had achieved was a menace to their interests, and they went willingly into the Union at the start, and supported it generously, but they were an impatient people, demanding quick results, and when they saw that the relief the Union promised could only come through lawsuits and legislation, which it would take perhaps years to finish, they lost interest and refused money. At the first meeting of the Grand Council of the Union in November, 1878, there were nearly 200 delegates present. At the last one in February, 1880, scarcely 40. Many of the local lodges were entirely dead. Not even the revival in the summer of 1879 of the hated immediate shipment order, which had caused so much excitement the year before, but which had not been enforced long because of the uprising, brought them back to the Union. In July the order had been put in operation again in a fashion most offensive to the oil men, it being announced by the United Pipe Lines that thereafter oil would be bought by a system of sealed bids. Blanks were to be furnished the producers, the formula of which ran: Bradford, Pennsylvania, 1870. I hereby offer to sell J. A. Bostwick X barrels crude oil of 42 gallons per barrel at X cents at the wells, for shipment from the United Pipe Lines within the next 5 days, provided that any portion of the oil not delivered to you within the specified time shall be considered cancelled. This was a frightful uproar in consequence. The morning after this announcement several hundred men gathered in front of the United Pipe Lines office in Bradford and held an open air meeting. They had a band on the ground which played "Hold the Fort," and the following resolutions were adopted: Resolved, that the oil producers of the Northern District in meeting assembled do maintain and declare that the present shipment order is infamous in principle and disreputable in practice, and we hereby declare that we will not sell one barrel of oil in conformity with the requirements of the said order. And we pledge our lives, our fortunes, and our sacred honor to resort to every legal means, to use every influence in our power to prevent any sales under the said order. And we also declare that the United Pipe Lines shall hereafter perform their duty as common carriers under the law." That night a battalion of some 300 masked men in robes of white marched through the streets of Bradford, droning those that they suspected of being in sympathy with the Standard methods, and cheering their friends. Again there appeared there that night all over the upper oil country cabalistic signs which had been seen there often the year before. The feeling was so intense, and the danger of riot so great, that 24 hours after the order for sealed bids was given, it was withdrawn. The outbreak aroused Mr. Campbell's hope that it might be possible at this moment to arouse the lodges, and he wrote a prominent oil man of Bradford asking his opinion. In reply he received the following letter. It shows very well what the leaders had to contend against. It shows, too, the point of view of a very frank and intelligent oil producer. Bradford, Pennsylvania, July 30, 1879. B. B. Campbell, Parnassus, Pennsylvania. Dear Sir, your dispatch of yesterday from O.C. has only just reached me. As I cannot say what I want to over the wires, I reply by mail. You ask if the high-sounding wording of the Declaration of Rights of the producers made at their mass meeting, held here on Monday, in which they pledged their lives, fortunes, and sacred honors, means liberal subscriptions to the Council funds. I reply with sorrow and humiliation. I fear not. All this high-flown talk is bunkum of the worst kind. The producers are willing to meet in a mass meeting held out of doors, where it costs nothing even for the rent of a hall, and pass any kind of a resolution that is offered. It costs nothing to do this, but when asked to contribute $1 to the legal prosecution of these plunderers, robbers, and fugitives from justice, whom they are denouncing in their resolution, they either positively refuse, say that the Council is doing nothing, that the suits are interminable and will never end, that there is no justice to be obtained in the courts of Pennsylvania, etc., etc., or else plead poverty and say they have contributed all that they are able to. True, the producers are poor, and the suits and legal proceedings are slow, and there is much to discourage them. But I tell you, my honored chief, that the true inwardness of this state of affairs is, that the people of the Oil Regions have by slow degrees and early stages been brought into a condition of bondage and serfdom by the monopoly until now, when they have been aroused to a realization of their condition, they have not the courage or manhood left to enable them to strike a blow for liberty. And these are the people for whom you and your few faithful followers in the Council are laboring, spending, I fear wasting, your substance, neglecting your own interests to advance theirs. And all for what good? Cui bono? I fear you will say that I am discouraged. No, not discouraged, but disgusted with the poor, spiritless, and faint-hearted people whom you are laboring so hard to liberate from bondage. As to the prospects of raising funds for the prosecution of the suits by subscription or assessments on the unions, I am sorry to say that I fear it is impossible. At least it is impossible for me to make any collections. And right here let me make a suggestion. I often feel that the fault may not be with the people, but with the writer. I would therefore suggest that you select from among the members of the Council any good man whom you think has the power of convincing these people that their only hope of relief lies in sustaining you in the prosecution of the suits, and therefore they must contribute to the fund. If you will do this, I will promise you that he will be hospitably received and favourably introduced by the writer. But as for deciding on the unaided efforts of myself to raise funds, I fear it would be useless. I do not write this, my friend, with a view of throwing any discouragement in your path, which God knows is rugged and thorny enough, but I must give vent to my righteous indignation in some way, and ask you, are the producers as a class, nothing but a damned cowardly disorganised mob as they are, worth the efforts you are putting forth to save them? As for myself, a single individual, and I can speak for no others, I am determined to stand with you until the end, with my best strength and my last dollar. Now what was this loose and easily discouraged organization opposing? A compact body of a few able, cold-blooded men, men to whom anything was right that they could get, men knowing exactly what they wanted, men who loved the game they played because of the reward at the goal, and above all, men who knew how to hold their tongues and wait. To Mr. Rockefeller, they say in the Oil Regions, a day is as a year, and a year as a day. He can wait, but he never gives up. Mr. Rockefeller knew the producers, knew how feeble their staying qualities in anything but the putting down of oil wells, and he might have said confidently at the beginning of their suits against him, as it was reported he did say, that they would never be finished. They had not been finished from any lack of material. If the suits had been pushed, but one result was possible, and that was the conviction of both the Standard and the railroads. They had been left unfinished because of the impatience and instability of the prosecuting body and the compactness, resolution, and watchfulness of the defendants. The withdrawal of the suits was a great victory for Mr. Rockefeller. There was no longer any doubt of his power in defensive operations. Having won a victory, he quickly went to work to make it secure. The Union had surrendered, but the men who had made the Union remained. The evidence against him was piled up in indestructible records. In time the same elements which had united to form the serious opposition just overthrown might come together, and if they should, it was possible they would not a second time make the mistake of vacillation. The press of the Oil Regions was largely independent. It had lost, to be sure, the audacity, the wit, the irrepressible spirit of 8 years before, when it fought the South Improvement Company. Its discretion had outstripped its courage, but there were still signs of intelligent independence in the newspapers. Mr. Rockefeller now entered on a campaign of reconciliation which aimed to placate or silence every opposing force. Many of the great tragedies of the Oil Regions lie in the individual compromises which followed the public settlement of 1880. For then it was that man after man, from hopelessness, from disgust, from ambition, from love of money, gave up the fight for principle which he had waged for 7 years. The Union has surrendered, they said. Why fight on? This man took a position with the Standard and became henceforth active in its business. That man took a salary and dropped out of sight. This one went his independent way, but with closed lips. That one shook the dust of the Oil Regions from his feet and went out to seek God's country, asking only that he should never again hear the word oil. The newspapers bowed to the victor. A sudden hush came over the region, the hush of defeat, of cowardice, of hopelessness. Only the poor producer grumbled. You can't satisfy the producer, Mr. Rockefeller often has had occasion to remark benignantly and pitifully. The producer alone was not convinced. He still rehearsed the series of dramatic attacks and sieges which had wiped out independent effort. He taught his children that the cause had been sold, and he stigmatized the men who had gone over to the Standard as traitors. Scores of boys and girls grew up in the Oil Regions in those days, with the same feeling of terrified curiosity toward those who had sold to the Standard that they had towards those who had been in jail. The Oil Regions as a whole was at heart as irreconcilable in 1880 as it had been after the South Improvement Company fight, and now it had added to its sense of outrage the humiliation of defeat. Its only immediate hope now was in the success of one of the transportation enterprises which had come into existence with the uprising of 1878, and to which it had been for 2 years giving what support it could. This enterprise was the seaboard pipe line which, as we have seen, Messrs. Benson, McKelvy, and Hopkins had undertaken. This is the end of The History of Standard Oil, Volume 1. Recording by Tom Weiss, Tom'sAudiobooks.com.